I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this episode, what we're going to do is to take our third dive into the concept of creating spaces within mixes. And this time we're going to concentrate on the top end. And probably without me even needing to say that introduction, it would be clear the moment I do this. Now, you know me, I'm as much a fan of treble and all of the good stuff that happens up at the top of mixes as the next man or woman. And you'll know, in fact, if you watch this channel with any regularity, that I've got a whole language around the idea of fizz and tiz and all sorts of words that I use to describe what happens at the top end. And treble is amazing because it provides us with this kind of amazing, kind of sugary burst of electricity and wonder and excitement. But my word, there's too much of it going on in this record and too much of it going on in too many records, because we reach for the top end, particularly when our ears start getting tired. So you'll probably notice that if you work on a track all day, what tends to happen is that by the end of the day, you've turned the volume up in the room because you want the energy to come from the speakers. You want to be propelled by it as your ears start to get tired. We compensate by turning volume up. The other thing we start doing is making our mixes brighter because we want all of that increased adrenaline that comes from things that bite. Following the day, we come back, fire up our mixes, and we cannot believe the kind of ear-bleeding horror that comes out of our tweeters as we push things too hard. So what we're going to do within this mix is we're going to appraise all of the sounds within it, and we're going to work out what they're actually doing and what we want them for, and we're going to find a place for them. And hopefully what that means is we're going to sort of deprioritize treble in some instances where we just don't need it. But what I'm also going to do before we go any further is just to fire up Mastering Assistant, because I'm interested to know whether or not Mastering Assistant agrees with me that there's too much treble in this track. So after a little bit of analysis, well, yeah, sure enough, we've got this kind of dip. Even Mastering Assistant wants to be cutting out a little bit of volume from around sort of 5 to 10K. And actually, I think our little sort of AI mastering program here is being generous to me, because I think I'd be tempted to go a little bit further than just that amount of cut. Okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset that setting, but we will mix into Mastering Assistant. It feels like a piece of music that is appropriate for this kind of processor, but I did notice that the output channel was just slightly overloading. So what I'm going to do before we go any further is just to put in a little gain plugin, a little cheat code here for just taking out a little bit of level before that output stage, just to ensure we're not getting any distortion. Okay, it's time to listen to the individual tracks of this mix one by one. Okay, here's the first one. Okay, so where is your ear drawn? Is it drawn to the kind of low little interesting thing? Is it drawn to the kind of clap, or is it drawn to the hats right up at the top? Which sound are we looking for? And that's the question we need to ask ourselves whenever we appraise these loops. So I'm going to remember that one. We're going to come back to it in a moment. Next. Okay, so that's an even more relevant question to ask here, because definitely the ear is drawn to the kind of mid-rangey, upper, low treble stuff. And yet there's this kind of electro kind of triangle-y thing happening at really low level, which is amazingly shiny. Okay, next. Okay, so again, we've got some sort of low level, lower pitched percussive stuff happening here, but this definitely feels like the busiest kind of hi-hat pattern in terms of the loops that we've got going on within this project. I'm also just interested to hear this loop too. Sorry, weirdly I pressed play twice, which is why it skipped. Okay, so this is clearly our kick drum, and yet there's a kind of shaker glued to every single hit. as well as the other bits and pieces. So there's lots of treble there as well, and that's just in the percussive world. Now the bass is definitely a bass, and I'm kind of happy with the synths. So what we've got to do now is to decide what we want all of these loops to actually be. How much treble do we want in each of them? Well, let's start with this kick beat, because I definitely want the kick beat to be providing the kick. That's why I put it in the project. Do I need it to be doing anything else? Well, not really. So what I'm going to start by doing is to see what I can get away with in terms of preserving the way that the kick feels as a kick, but just using EQ to carve out some space at the top end to get rid of some of this kind of shakery stuff we just don't need. Now, a couple of ways I could do this. I could do it brutally by using a filter up at the top end. And when I say brutally, what I really mean is as I drop this level, we'll see that I get this kind of cliff edge approach to getting rid of high frequency content. Now we can amend that in a minute, but the great thing about filters is they very quickly latch us into the frequency content we're retaining and a clear sense of what it is that we're throwing away. Now, I like a little bit of the kind of clap snap thing that's happening on the backbeat within this loop, and I've obviously gone after that a little bit with this really extreme filter setting. But what I could do with the filter would be to say, okay, well, this feels like around the right cutoff frequency to be attenuating frequency content above this, but maybe a 24 dB per octave filter is a little bit brutal. So let's halve that value, which means that those volumes that we're attenuating are now going to be twice as loud as they were before. In other words, I'm asking this filter to work only half as hard as it was before. Okay, so the good thing about that is it doesn't really feel like I'm compromising the low end of the kick drum at all. It feels like we're still getting all of that thump, but what we are doing is just significantly rolling out the kind of high end of this loop, which I just don't need because I know that in other loops I've got that happening. Now I'm going to leave this hi-hat part alone for a moment. This is our main, I think, element for driving the top end of this mix. I'm going to leave that one exactly where it is right now, and what I'm going to do instead is to come to the one above. I'm just going to remind myself what this loop sounds like. Okay, so I'm tempted to see whether or not I can carve a space for the sounds I want to retain within this sound using the auto filter rather than using an EQ. And if I can't, we'll use EQ instead. Let's just make this a little bit bigger. So I'm interested in the kind of bandpass filter. I like the kind of middle of this loop. I want to get rid of high frequency content up at the top, and I want to get rid of low frequency content at the bottom, retaining the central bands of this in the middle. So I'm going to get rid of all envelope shaping for a moment and just see if we can find a space in the middle which feels like it's kind of right for the sounds we want to retain. So I like all of this stuff, all this kind of industrial, clangy, slightly syncopated stuff that's going on. And we only have to push the cutoff frequency up to remind ourselves what was happening at the top before it got filtered. Okay, that feels better to me, and you can see obviously what I've also done, partly to get some volume back, but also just to give it a little bit of extra drive, is to push some distortion after that filter section as well. Again, we've significantly thinned out what's happening right up at the top end of this loop. Okay, let's see what's happening on the first one again. Now this sound would also be a really interesting candidate for a bandpass filter for two reasons. Firstly, I don't really need what's happening at the top end, but also there's loads of stuff happening at the bottom which might be compromising the kick drum. Now, we've looked at clearing out space in previous episodes at the lower end, so we're going to just sort of go through this relatively quickly, but I'm willing to bet that when we fire up the channel EQ on this sound, we're going to see some low frequency content we just don't need. Okay, so that's dealt with the bottom end. This time at the top end, rather than this absolutely brutal filter approach that we took with the first loop, what I'm going to do instead is to fire up the high shelf. This time I'm going to back down volume substantially without it being an absolute cliff edge. So effectively what shelves do is to allow me to roll out frequency content progressively so that effectively we're just backing out a really broad range of frequencies. Let's have a listen to this. So what we're keeping here is the kind of the lower end of the hi-hat. It's quite fun to make that sound, I'm going to be honest, but we're losing the on top of it. Yeah, I know. You're welcome. Okay, let's put all these loops in together, one after another, and we're going to just see what happens when we compare the original versions of them to their unprocessed one. So this is the one I'm going to keep out for now. This is the one that I think is going to be our main hi-hat. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to stripe across all of these plugins. So effectively we're going to hear the originals and I'm going to punch them back in from the second time round. Okay, so it feels a little bit like the kick could be louder. And of course, suddenly, I mean, would I have turned anything up with the kind of deafening treble that we had going on before? Probably not. But we're definitely missing that top end now because, of course, we've carved out space from those other loops. So let's come back to the one that I've left out until now and listen to it again. Okay, and let's put that in with the others. Yeah, that's actually really hard to listen to now. That amazingly kind of piercing, bright hi-hatness that was happening sort of across all of these loops. That definitely feels better, like we've carved out a specific role for each of these individual sounds. Okay, let's listen to it in context. So I'm going to play the whole track. That means we are going to have to listen to the full hi-hat experience we were having happening before, or we had happening before. And then again, I'll just stripe across those plugins and we'll have a listen to, hopefully, how much more curated this collection of sounds feels for having stripped out that top end. Now, remember what I said at the beginning about the idea that treble provides this kind of amazingly seductive energy. It just gives us all of this extra fizz. And there's no doubt that, of course, by sort of unbypassing those plugins and going back to the kind of full, naked, trebly piercingness. What does that mean? Nevertheless, I've said it. We get all of this extra kind of bite, and in this context, that's not necessarily a good thing, but the interesting thing is that we now actually have space for a bit more room within the drums from a level perspective than we had before. One thing I could do now would be to put all of the drums into a track stack. And I'm going to just do that very quickly now. So this is going to be our drums. And actually there might be room for a bit more level across the entire drum mix as a result of the fact that we're not getting kind of poked in the eye by all that treble. So what we've done within this episode is to carve a space for the sounds within our mixes, and that's becoming a recurring theme whenever we talk about creating mix space in specific frequency areas. What do you want the role of each of the loops and the sounds within your project to actually be? And then what we've done is we've appraised each one, and we've appropriately taken steps to make sure that only the sounds which are really requiring that extra treble have got it. Out of the others, what we've done is to carve out some space using filters and using EQs. And as a result of that, what we've actually discovered is that there is more potential energy in the drums. When we track stack them, we can give everything a push, and now we get this kind of toughness that's coming from the bottom end without this awful kind of nasty effect that we get with all of this treble coming from left, right and center. I think it's a lot better now.